It was a cold, moonlit night. James, a 34-year-old businessman, was driving back to the city after attending a late meeting in a remote town. The GPS on his phone flickered and then stopped working. The vast, empty road ahead seemed endless, with tall, shadowy trees on either side swaying gently in the wind. The silence inside the car was unnerving, broken only by the low hum of the engine. James tried to shake off his unease by turning on the radio, but all he heard was static. "Strange," he muttered, switching it off. The road signs had disappeared miles back, and now it felt as if he were driving in circles. After what felt like an eternity, he spotted a figure in the distance. It was a woman in a long white dress, standing by the roadside, her face hidden under her cascading black hair. She raised her hand, signaling for a lift. James slowed the car, but his instincts screamed against stopping. There was something unsettling about her stillness, yet guilt overrode his fear. She might need help, he thought, and rolled down the window slightly. "Do you need a ride?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. The woman didn't respond. She simply nodded and walked toward the passenger side. James unlocked the door, and she silently slid in. The air inside the car felt colder as she entered. James adjusted the rearview mirror to get a better look at her, but her face remained obscured. "Where are you headed?" he asked, glancing nervously at her. "To the end of the road," she said in a voice so soft it was barely audible. James shivered but told himself it was just the cold. He continued driving, the road ahead stretching endlessly. Minutes turned into hours, and James noticed something eerie. The trees, the bends in the road, even the faint landmarks outside looked the same as before. It was as if he hadn't moved at all. "I think I might have taken a wrong turn," James said, hoping for some response from the woman. She didn't reply. Instead, she lifted her hand and pointed ahead. "Keep going," she whispered. James felt a chill run down his spine. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. "This can't be real," he muttered. As they drove on, James noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. The woman's reflection wasn't there. His heart raced, and he struggled to keep his composure. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice trembling. The woman turned her head slowly toward him, and for the first time he saw her face. Her eyes were hollow, her skin pale and lifeless. "I told you," she said, her voice now echoing unnaturally. To the end of the road, James slammed the brakes, the car screeching to a halt. He turned to the passenger seat, but it was empty. The woman had vanished. Panic set in as James stepped out of the car, gasping for air. The road behind him was gone, replaced by a thick, impenetrable fog. Ahead, the path stretched into darkness. He was trapped on this endless, haunted journey. James stood frozen on the road, staring into the thick fog behind him. His heart pounded as the eerie silence pressed in. "This can't be happening," he whispered, rubbing his temples. He turned back to the car, hoping it would somehow bring him a sense of control, but the passenger seat was still empty. The air felt heavier now, almost suffocating. James climbed back into the car, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "Just drive," he told himself. "Keep moving." As the car rolled forward, the road stretched endlessly, the same dark trees and faint shadows lining the sides. He checked his phone again, still no signal. "How far does this road go?" he muttered. Suddenly, he saw a flickering light in the distance. His heart leapt. It looked like a lantern, swaying gently in the dark. As he got closer, he saw an old man standing by the roadside, leaning on a crooked cane. His face was lined with age, and his clothes looked worn and dusty. James hesitated but rolled down the window. "Hey, do you know where this road leads?" he asked. The old man looked up slowly, his eyes glinting in the faint light. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice raspy and low. "What do you mean?" James asked, his throat dry. "This road doesn't end," the old man replied, stepping closer. "It keeps you until it takes what it wants." James's grip on the wheel tightened. "Takes what it wants? What are you talking about?" The old man leaned in, his face now inches from the window. "You picked up the woman, didn't you?" James froze. How did he know? I thought she needed help," he stammered. The old man shook his head, his expression grim. "She's not human. She's bound to this road. And now so are you." James felt his chest tighten. "There has to be a way out," he said desperately. "There has to be." The old man stepped back, his lantern casting eerie shadows on his face. "There's only one way," he said. "Face her. But be warned, it's not easy. She feeds on fear, on guilt." Before James could ask more, the old man vanished into the fog, leaving only the faint glow of his lantern behind. James sat in stunned silence, his mind racing. "Face her? What does that even mean?" he muttered. The car suddenly jolted, as if something had hit it from behind. James whipped around, but there was nothing there. The air felt colder, and the faint sound of whispers filled the car. "Keep driving," a soft, familiar voice whispered in his ear. James clenched his jaw and slammed his foot on the gas, the car speeding down the endless road. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he knew one thing. He couldn't stop now. James kept his hands steady on the wheel, but his mind was anything but calm. The whispers had stopped, but the weight of the old man's words lingered in the air. "She feeds on fear, on guilt." His headlights pierced through the dense fog, illuminating the narrow road ahead. The silence was unnerving. Even the engine sounded muffled, as though the car was afraid to disturb the stillness. James glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, behind him. But it was empty. He exhaled slowly, trying to steady his nerves. Then, out of nowhere, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, followed by a faint, chilling melody. It was a woman humming, her voice haunting yet strangely familiar. James's skin prickled. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice echoing in the confined space. The humming stopped, replaced by a soft laugh. "James," the voice whispered. His blood ran cold. "How do you know my name?" The voice didn't answer. Instead, the air in the car grew icy, and the windows fogged up. A handprint appeared on the passenger side window, slowly dragging down as if someone was outside, trying to get in. James slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, and he jumped out, his breath visible in the cold air. He circled the car, shining his phone's flashlight at the windows, but no one was there. As he turned back toward the driver's side, he froze. A figure stood in the middle of the road, draped in a long, tattered dress. Her face was obscured by her hair, but James knew who it was. "Why are you doing this?" he called out, his voice trembling. The woman tilted her head, her movements slow and unnatural. "You brought me here," she said, her voice echoing like it came from everywhere at once. "I didn't mean to," James said, backing away. "I was just trying to help." The woman stepped closer, her bare feet making no sound on the asphalt. "Help?" she repeated, her tone mocking. "You can't help me. No one can." James felt his back hit the car. He was trapped. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The woman stopped a few feet away, her hair lifting slightly as though moved by an invisible wind. "You're running," she said, "but you can't run from yourself." Before James could respond, the fog thickened, swallowing her figure. He stumbled back into the car and locked the doors, his heart racing. The radio crackled again, but this time it was a man's voice. "James, you have to face her. Don't let the guilt consume you." "Who are you?" James shouted, gripping the steering wheel. The voice didn't answer. The radio went silent, leaving James alone with his thoughts and the heavy fog. He took a deep breath and started the car. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but now it wasn't just the road he feared. It was himself. James gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. The car hummed along the dark road, but everything else felt wrong. The fog wasn't clearing. It seemed to grow thicker, wrapping around the car like a living thing. He glanced at the dashboard clock. The hands were frozen at 12:01, even though he'd been driving for what felt like hours. This can't be real, he muttered under his breath. Out of the corner of his eye, James noticed movement in the rearview mirror. His heart pounded as he glanced up. A shadowy figure sat in the back seat, barely visible in the dim light. "Who are you?" James demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't respond. Slowly, it leaned forward, and James could see its eyes. Empty, dark, and filled with malice. "You shouldn't have come back," it said in a low, guttural voice. James swerved the car, nearly running off the road. He turned around to confront the figure, but the back seat was empty. Breathing heavily, he pulled over and stepped out of the car. The fog pressed against him, cold and damp. The road ahead looked endless, stretching into nothingness. As he stood there, trying to gather his thoughts, he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and getting closer. "Who's there?" James called out, spinning around. From the fog emerged the woman in the tattered dress. This time, her face was visible. Her skin was pale, her lips cracked, and her hollow eyes stared straight into his soul. "You can't escape," she said softly. James backed away, but the woman didn't move closer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed behind him. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice trembling. She didn't answer. James turned to look in the direction she pointed, and there it was, a small, rundown house, barely visible through the fog. It hadn't been there before. The woman's voice echoed in his head. "You must face it." James felt an overwhelming urge to approach the house. He didn't want to go, but his legs moved on their own, carrying him forward. The closer he got, the heavier the air became. The door creaked open as he approached, as though it had been waiting for him. Inside, the house was eerily quiet. The walls were covered in faded, peeling wallpaper. A faint smell of decay hung in the air. On the floor lay an old photo album. James hesitated before picking it up. As he flipped through the pages, his chest tightened. The pictures were of him. Images from his childhood, his teenage years, and even recent moments he thought he had forgotten. In the last photo, he saw himself standing on this very road, with the woman in the background watching him. "What is this?" he whispered, his hands shaking. The woman's voice echoed again. "The truth you've buried." Suddenly, the door slammed shut, and the house seemed to breathe, the walls pulsating as if alive. James clutched the photo album, his mind racing. "What do you mean? What truth?" he shouted, but only silence answered him. The floorboards creaked beneath him, and a shadow stretched across the room. James turned, but the shadow wasn't his. It was hers. The woman stood in the corner, her face twisted into a sorrowful expression. "You know why I'm here," she said. James shook his head, his voice barely a whisper. "No, I don't." The woman stepped closer, and with each step, memories James had long suppressed began to surface. James felt frozen in place as the woman stepped closer. The walls of the house seemed to close in, the air heavy and suffocating. Her hollow eyes locked onto his, full of sadness and something darker, something he couldn't name. "What do you want from me?" he whispered, his voice trembling. The woman stopped just a few feet away. Her gaze pierced through him. "You've forgotten," she said, her voice soft but heavy with meaning. "Forgotten what?" James asked, shaking his head. I don't know you. Her expression didn't change. Instead, she raised a hand and pointed to the photo album James still held tightly. The weight of it in his hands felt unbearable now. Look closer, she urged. James hesitated but turned to the last photo again, the one of him on this same road. The details were clearer now. He wasn't just standing there. He was holding something in his hand. A shovel. No, James muttered, his heart pounding. This doesn't make sense. The memories hit him like a tidal wave. He remembered driving down this road late at night, the same eerie fog surrounding him. He wasn't alone. There was someone else in the car with him. Who was it? James whispered to himself, his hands trembling. The woman's voice grew sharper. You know, James clutched his head as the memories flooded back. It was her. She had been with him that night. There had been an argument, voices raised, accusations thrown. He couldn't remember why, but he knew it had ended in tragedy. He started, but the words felt hollow. Deep down, he knew the truth. The woman's face softened, but her eyes remained filled with pain. You left me here, she said. No, James said, stepping back. I didn't mean to. It was an accident. The walls of the house seemed to shake, the floorboards groaning under his feet. The photo album fell from his hands, its pages scattering across the room. Each one showed moments he had buried deep in his mind, moments he had tried to forget. Please, James begged, his voice cracking. I didn't mean for it to happen. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she pointed toward the door. James turned to look, and the door creaked open, revealing the dark road outside. You must finish what you started, she said. James felt a chill run down his spine. He stepped out of the house, the cold air biting at his skin. The fog seemed thicker now, and in the distance he could see a faint glow, a lantern flickering in the darkness. He didn't want to go, but something pulled him forward. His feet moved on their own, carrying him toward the light. As he got closer, he saw it wasn't just a lantern. It was the same shovel from the photo, leaning against a tree. Next to it was a patch of disturbed earth, the dirt still loose. James's breath caught in his throat. He remembered now, digging, the weight of the shovel in his hands, and the guilt that had consumed him afterward. I can't do this, he said, his voice shaking. You have to. The woman's voice echoed around him. James reached for the shovel, his hands trembling. As he touched it, the ground beneath him seemed to pulse, as if the earth itself was alive. He started digging, each scoop of dirt feeling heavier than the last. The air grew colder, the fog pressing in on him. Finally, the shovel hit something solid. James froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Keep going, the voice urged. With trembling hands, he unearthed what he had buried. A small, weathered box. The sight of it sent a wave of nausea through him. He knelt down, his fingers trembling as he opened the box. Inside was a locket, its chain tangled and tarnished. He recognized it immediately. It had belonged to her. What do you want from me? James asked, tears streaming down his face. The woman appeared beside him, her form more solid now. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the locket. You must remember, she said, her voice softer now. James closed his eyes, the memories rushing back in full force. The fight, the car swerving, and the terrible moment when everything went silent. He had left her here, too scared to face what had happened. I'm sorry, he whispered, his voice breaking. The woman's expression softened, and for the first time, she smiled. A sad, fleeting smile. It's time, she said. The fog began to lift, and the road ahead became clear. The woman's form started to fade, her presence growing lighter. James clutched the locket tightly, feeling a strange sense of peace and sorrow. He knew what he had to do now, to face the truth and make amends. As the woman disappeared, her voice lingered in the air. "Thank you." James stood alone on the road, the weight of his guilt replaced by a bittersweet sense of closure. He turned back to his car, ready to face whatever lay ahead. James sat in his car, gripping the locket tightly in his hand. The cold metal felt alive, pulsing softly as if it carried the heartbeat of the past. He couldn't drive. Not yet. His mind raced, replaying the memories he had unlocked. The fog outside had cleared slightly, revealing the winding road ahead. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional rustle of the wind. James exhaled deeply, leaning his head against the steering wheel. "What now?" he muttered to himself. The locket felt heavier, and he opened it slowly. Inside was a picture, a young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. Her name was etched into the delicate metal frame. "Anna, Anna," James whispered, his voice trembling. The guilt that weighed on him now felt unbearable. As he stared at the locket, a faint tapping sound broke the silence. James froze. The tapping grew louder, coming from the passenger side of the car. Slowly, he turned his head. A shadowy figure stood outside, barely visible in the dim light. Its hand was pressed against the window, leaving frost where it touched the glass. James's heart pounded. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved, gliding toward the front of the car. James's breath quickened as the shadow passed in front of the headlights, revealing a familiar silhouette. It was Anna, but something was different. Her form flickered like a weak flame, her face pale and expressionless. She stared directly at him, her hollow eyes filled with sorrow. "James," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. He opened the car door and stepped out, his legs unsteady. "Anna, I'm so sorry." Don't," she interrupted, raising her hand. "The past can't be changed." James felt tears sting his eyes. "I should have stayed. I should have." "You ran," she said, her voice firm but not angry. "You left me here, buried in silence." The words cut deep, but her tone softened. "But now you've come back. That means something." James felt a lump in his throat. "What can I do? How can I make this right?" Anna didn't answer immediately. Instead, she pointed toward the horizon, where the faint outline of a distant house emerged from the shadows. "You need to go there," she said. James frowned, staring at the house. It looked abandoned, its windows dark and broken. "What's there?" "The truth," Anna replied, "and the chance to set us both free." James hesitated. His instincts screamed to stay away, but something about Anna's presence gave him courage. He nodded. "I'll do it," he said. Anna's form flickered again, her edges dissolving into the mist. "Remember, James," she said, her voice growing faint. "The truth is the only way forward." And with that, she vanished. James stood alone on the road, the distant house looming ahead. He climbed back into the car, gripping the locket tightly. As he started the engine, the headlights illuminated the path before him, and he drove toward the unknown. The closer he got to the house, the more the air changed. The temperature dropped, and the air grew heavier, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The house seemed alive, its dark windows watching him as he approached. He parked the car and stepped out, the gravel crunching beneath his feet. The front door of the house creaked open on its own, revealing a dark interior. James hesitated, his heart racing. Anna said to face the truth. He muttered to himself, summoning his courage. He stepped inside, the door slamming shut behind him. The house smelled of damp wood and decay. Shadows danced on the walls, their movements unnatural. In the center of the room stood a table, and on it was an old journal. James walked over, his hands trembling as he picked it up. The pages were filled with Anna's handwriting, each word a piece of the puzzle. As he read, the memories came flooding back. Moments he had buried, truths he had denied. The final entry made his blood run cold. If you're reading this, James, you've found your way back. But the journey isn't over. The shadows won't let us rest until you confront what truly happened. A sudden crash echoed from upstairs, and James's head snapped up. The house was no longer silent. Footsteps thudded above, slow and deliberate. He closed the journal and gripped the locket, its warmth steadying him. "I'm not running this time," he said aloud, his voice firm. James took a deep breath and began climbing the creaking staircase, each step pulling him closer to the heart of the darkness. James reached the top of the staircase, his heart pounding. The hallway stretched before him, dimly lit by a flickering light bulb. The air was cold, and a faint smell of mildew clung to the walls. Each step he took felt heavier, as though the house didn't want him there. At the end of the hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. A soft, eerie whisper seeped through the crack, like voices carried on the wind. James hesitated, gripping the locket in his pocket. "Anna," he whispered, as if saying her name would give him strength. The whispers grew louder. They weren't angry or threatening. They sounded sad, almost pleading. James felt a pull toward the door, like an invisible hand urging him forward. He pushed the door open slowly. The room inside was small and bare, with faded wallpaper peeling off the walls. A single chair sat in the center of the room, facing a tall, cracked mirror. James's reflection stared back at him, but something was off. His reflection moved a second slower than he did, like it was watching him rather than mimicking him. "Who are you?" he asked aloud, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped. The room grew eerily silent, and James's reflection smiled. A cold, unnatural smile that didn't belong to him. "James," the reflection said, its voice not his own. "Do you remember?" James stepped back, his breath quickening. "Remember what?" The reflection didn't answer. Instead, it raised its hand and pointed to the corner of the room. James turned slowly, his eyes widening as he saw what was there. A bundle of old, torn fabric lay in the corner. It was covered in dust, but something about it felt alive. James hesitated before stepping closer, his every instinct telling him to leave. As he knelt down, he noticed something sticking out of the fabric. A small wooden music box. His hands shook as he picked it up. The moment he touched it, the room changed. The air grew heavier, and the whispers returned, louder and more frantic. The walls seemed to close in, and the light flickered wildly. James opened the music box, and a haunting melody filled the room. It was a tune he hadn't heard in years, one Anna used to hum when they were together. Tears welled up in his eyes as memories rushed back. Happy moments, laughter, and then the night he left, the night he chose to walk away from her. "I'm sorry," James whispered, his voice cracking. The whispers softened, almost as if they were forgiving him. But the mirror behind him shattered with a loud crash, and James spun around. Through the broken glass, he saw something, a vision of the past. Anna stood in the house, looking out of the window. She was waiting for him, her face filled with hope. But the hope turned to despair as hours passed, and he never came. Shadows crept into the room, surrounding her. They weren't just darkness. They were alive, feeding on her sorrow. "No," James said, stepping closer to the mirror. I didn't know you needed me." The vision faded, leaving only his reflection staring back at him. The smile was gone, replaced by a look of pain. The whispers stopped again, and a single word echoed in the room. "Finish, James looked down at the music box, now glowing faintly. He understood. He had to finish what he started. He had to confront the truth and free both himself and Anna from the shadows that held them captive. With renewed determination, James left the room, clutching the music box tightly. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face it. The house seemed to guide him now, its walls shifting and opening paths where there were none before. He followed the faint melody of the music box, each step bringing him closer to the heart of the darkness. The music box's soft melody echoed in the stillness, each note hanging in the air like a thread pulling James deeper into the house. His fingers tightened around the box as the walls seemed to shift, guiding him toward something he couldn't quite understand yet, but he knew it was important. He had to follow it. The house was alive now, its creaking floorboards and groaning walls no longer just noises of age. They felt like warnings. Whispers seemed to seep from the cracks in the walls, quiet voices calling his name, urging him forward. James pushed through his fear, focusing on the music box's haunting tune. It led him down a narrow, dimly lit corridor at the far end of the house, the walls barely wide enough for him to pass through. His heart raced as he reached the end of the hall and saw a heavy door. The air around it was thick, like the house itself was holding its breath. He reached for the door handle, but the moment his fingers brushed it, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. He hesitated, his pulse pounding in his ears. But he knew there was no turning back now. With a deep breath, he turned the handle and pushed the door open. Inside was a small room, its walls covered in old, faded photographs. Some were of people James didn't recognize, others were of him, young and smiling, standing beside a girl he knew all too well. Anna. His breath caught in his throat. Each photo seemed to show a moment in time, moments from his past, his life before he left. In every photo, Anna was by his side, her smile fading with each passing picture until the last one, which was torn in half. In the center of the room stood an old, wooden chair, its seat worn and cracked. And tied to the chair was Anna, but she wasn't the Anna he remembered. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, filled with terror. Her hair was tangled, and her clothes were torn. The image before him was not the woman he once knew. It was a ghost. Anna, he whispered, stepping closer. Her head snapped toward him, but her eyes were empty, hollow. You left me, she murmured, her voice a rasp, like a whisper carried through the wind. James took a step back, his stomach twisting. I didn't mean to. Anna's mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, but it wasn't her smile. It was something darker, something twisted. You left me to die in this house, to become part of it. The room seemed to shrink as shadows crawled across the walls, filling every corner. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air became thick, suffocating. The whispers rose again, but this time they were no longer soft and pleading. They were angry, full of rage. I never wanted this. I never wanted to hurt you, James said, his voice breaking. But Anna's form began to change. Her body started to contort, twisting in unnatural ways, her limbs stretching and cracking. The shadows that filled the room seemed to feed off her pain, growing stronger with each movement. James stumbled backward, his heart pounding in his chest. The music box, still clutched in his hands, began to glow brighter, its melody louder now. The shadows surged forward, and he realized, with a sickening twist of his gut, that the house was feeding on Anna's sorrow, and now it wanted him too. James, Anna's voice echoed, now multiple voices, all speaking at once. Finish what you started. Free us both. James's mind raced. He knew what he had to do, but he wasn't sure if he was ready. The shadows reached for him, their tendrils brushing against his skin, cold as ice. He fought against the pull, forcing his legs to move, to take him closer to Anna, to the chair. The music box's melody grew more intense, its tune almost unbearable now. He closed his eyes and whispered, "I'm sorry, Anna. I never meant for this to happen. I'll fix it." And with that, he placed the music box on the ground between Anna and the shadows. The instant it touched the floor, the room exploded with light, blinding him. The shadows screamed, their cries twisted and distorted as they were sucked into the music box. Anna's body stopped moving, her face softening, as though she were finally at peace. James fell to his knees, his heart racing, the music box still glowing. For a moment, everything was still. Then, a voice, soft but clear, whispered in his ear, "Thank you." It was Anna's voice, but there was no fear in it now, only gratitude. The house began to quiet, the oppressive atmosphere lifting as if the weight of years had been lifted. James stayed there for a long time, his hands trembling as he held the music box. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time he felt like he could breathe. The music box lay heavy in James's hands, its glow fading, but the air in the room remained thick with an eerie presence. He could still feel Anna's voice echoing in his mind, her thank you lingering like a soft whisper on the wind. But that peace was short-lived. The house wasn't done with him yet. James stood up, his legs shaky. He had freed Anna, or so he thought. But something deep inside him told him that this wasn't the end. The house had been too silent, too calm. And in the silence, he felt something stirring, something worse than the shadows, something ancient. As he slowly moved toward the door, his heart pounded in his chest. The hallway stretched out before him, but it felt like the walls were closing in, the space narrowing with every step. He turned back to glance at the room where Anna had been tied to the chair. The photos still lined the walls, faces staring back at him with hollow eyes. And in the corner where Anna had stood, something new had appeared. A dark figure standing still, watching him. James froze, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Anna. It was a man, tall, his face obscured by shadows, his body outlined in an unnatural, twisting shape. He was standing there, motionless, but there was something chilling about him, something malevolent. "You shouldn't have come here," the figure spoke, his voice deep and gravelly, like it came from the depths of the earth. "You think you freed her, but you've unleashed something far worse." The room seemed to pulse with the figure's words, the very air vibrating with an energy James couldn't comprehend. "You've made a terrible mistake," the man continued, his form flickering like a shadow in the dim light. "The house was never Anna's to begin with. It was mine." James's heart thudded in his chest. "Who are you?" he managed to whisper, his voice trembling. The man stepped forward, his form growing more defined with each passing moment. "I was the one who built this place. I was the one who trapped them all here. And now, you are mine too." The air turned icy, and James felt a cold dread crawl up his spine. The shadows began to twist around the figure, extending toward him like hungry hands. "You cannot escape," the man's voice echoed in every corner of the house. "Not now, not ever. You will become part of the house, just like she did." James backed away, his mind racing. He had to get out. He had to break the cycle. But how? The figure advanced, and the room seemed to stretch, the walls closing in around James. The whispers returned, louder this time, screaming in his ears. The shadows wrapped around him, pulling him toward the figure. Then the music box in his hands began to hum. Not the soft melody it had played before, but something darker, more intense. It was like the house itself was alive, responding to his fear. "Do you want to end this?" The man's voice slithered into James's ears. "Do you want to leave?" Then you must make a choice. James held the music box tightly, his breath ragged. What choice? He asked, though he was terrified of what he might hear. The man's smile twisted. The music box can end this, but to do so, you must destroy it. Destroy the very thing that brought you here. Destroy everything and free yourself. But remember, once it is gone, there is no return. James's eyes widened in horror. Destroy the box? The only thing that had kept him safe, the only thing that had helped him find Anna? Could he really do it? But the man's eyes, no, they weren't eyes at all. They were black voids, hollow and endless, pulling him in. James could feel himself slipping, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. To destroy it meant to destroy everything, the house, the curse, the ghosts. But was he willing to pay that price? The figure stepped closer, his presence suffocating. You don't have much time. Make your choice. The music box hummed louder now, and James could hear the faintest sound beneath the melody. The voices of those trapped in the house, crying out, pleading for release. They were all waiting for him to decide. Without another thought, James turned the music box over in his hands, looking at the fragile object. The power it held was undeniable. But at what cost? If he destroyed it, would he escape? Or would the house claim him, as it had claimed so many others? He gripped the box tightly, his decision made. With a quick motion, he smashed the box against the floor. There was a deafening silence, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, everything began to shake. The walls of the house groaned as if in agony, the shadows recoiling, the air thickening with an unbearable pressure. The lights flickered and then went out completely. The house was dying, and James, standing amidst the crumbling darkness, knew this was the end. The silence was deafening now. James stood in the wreckage of the house, the music box shattered at his feet. But as he looked around, he realized something terrible. The house wasn't gone. It wasn't destroyed. It had changed. The walls, once covered in faded photographs, were now bare. The floor beneath his feet was cold, cracked. The shadows had disappeared. But in the distance, in the farthest corner of the house, there was a flicker of movement. A figure walking slowly toward him. James's heart stopped. It was Anna. Her face was soft, no longer the twisted, tormented figure she had been. She was whole again, standing before him, her eyes filled with warmth. "You did it," she whispered, her voice clear and calm. "You freed us both." But James knew it wasn't over. Something was still wrong. He could feel it. There was a pull, a darkness that hadn't completely vanished. The house was still there, lurking beneath the surface, waiting. "Anna," James started, his voice barely a whisper. "Is it really over?" She smiled, but there was sadness in her eyes. "The house can never be fully destroyed. But you've done what you needed to do. Now you can go. You can leave this place." But James didn't move. He looked at her, his mind swirling with confusion. "What do you mean? I freed you. I freed us." Anna's expression softened. "I've been trapped here longer than you can imagine. And now you're free too. But remember, James, the house will always be here. In the shadows, in the whispers. You can't outrun it. Follows you." James took a step forward, but before he could say anything more, the house around them began to fade. The walls crumbled, the shadows returned, but Anna, she was gone. And just like that, he was alone.